Good day, because I don't know if you'll see this in the morning or the afternoon. For me, it's morning right now, but for you, it's whatever time. It's always going to be 5 o'clock somewhere for some of y'all. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, this is going to be a preview of your exam. Now, how would I put this? I don't like this format very much. I tried to use a word bank, but Canvas, if I want to use quiz format, which is easiest for y'all to use without having to do proctors and all kinds of other stupid stuff that we're not set up for, because I do my classes, do my tests in class. I just went ahead and put it down as a as one of your assignments. Now, you'll have two more assignments, two more that'll fall under assignments. One will be your final, which we're going to go over today. I will also attempt to load the midterm. Let me know, contact me on Canvas or on email if you want to retake the midterm as part of your final. I know some of y'all kind of had your heart set on it, so I need to have numbers so I know if I need to do a directed test or whether I need to make it open for the group. So if you're planning on taking your final during the exam period, I need to know so that I can go ahead and load that into Canvas. Otherwise, I'm going to send it to you as an individual test. So I just need some numbers. If it's more than 3, it's easy. It's easier for me to just nug through and load it on Canvas. And if it's less than 3, I only need to send it to you as an individual, and we'll use the honor system. You fill it in, send me the answers, and I grade it. So with that, we're going to do a review now of your final, and I'm only going to do the final part A, which is the stuff we've covered since the beginning of the semester, or since the midterm. So I know for some of y'all this is going to be interesting because we haven't done a face-to-face for any of this material. Hopefully you've been keeping up with my lectures. The last one I posted was our presidential challenge, which wasn't much of a challenge because I had to do the whole thing. But hopefully someday we'll be able to figure out how to do that on Zoom and have it posted for everybody. But like I said, I'm still doing baby steps on being an online professor, so we'll work through it. In the meantime, I'm going to do this as a pre-recorded message. It'll be posted hopefully to announcements unless I have to get IT involved and send it to you as a link package off the main server. We'll see what they come up with. At any rate, let's go ahead and get started. Like I said, if you have any questions on the exam, contact me immediately or as soon as you've received this message. Don't wait until the open period for the exam, which will be approximately, I will open it up on Monday and it will close on Friday. Like I said, I know some of y'all are working, some of y'all are taking care of sick relatives, some of y'all are having mom and dad come along and figure, hey, you're hanging around the house, you're not doing anything, which may or may not be true. I mean, I'm running into a little bit of that here where I'm sitting around playing on my computer and everybody thinks, oh, he's not busy. And I'm actually in the middle of trying to put my exam on Canvas. And oh my God, that's about 4 hours or 5 hours. Oh. But having said that, let's go. If I understand the thing, I mean, for all they know, I could be surfing Instapundit or something on the internet. So let's get started. We're going to go through the questions. You're going to have, now here's a little hint going in. On the fill in the blanks, I put in as many misspellings and everything as I could. The problem is for your fill in the blank questions, your short answer, you have to get the spelling mostly right. Also, remember proper versus common nouns. If you're talking about a specific person, it's always capitalized. For the presidents, I will generally take last names, but I will also take full names. The problem is, for every one of those, I had to type in every potential spelling. So spelling is going to be important on this test. So just know that going in. Your spelling and punctuation on this is going to be important because I can't look at the thing anymore and guess what you were trying to get in on fill in the blank. So you're going to have a little more time. One thing about this is I understand some of y'all are running on satellite internet. I know some of y'all are running on sharing a computer with 4 siblings or your parents or your aunts and uncles or that dude who was visiting from New York and can't make it home now. So at any rate, I have tried to make this as user-friendly as possible. We're basically going to follow the same rules as we did on the quiz. Same thing when I post your assessment test. It will more or less follow the quiz rules. You'll have 3 attempts because I know, you're on satellite internet and the cloud rolls by, or you're using old school analog DSL and somebody decides right now when they don't care you're taking a test, they need that pizza right now. So I understand the issue, so I've made it so you have 3 attempts. It'll be the same rules as your quiz. We're not going to go with proctoring in that because that gets to be a pain in the butt. Because what happens is I have to be on the computer or be available during the time you're taking the test, which is good because I could answer questions, but it's bad because this reduces your flexibility in taking the exam. I'm not a big believer, I'm not a big believer I mean, if you're doing an online course and you're missing out on all the interaction, you're missing out on getting to chat with your students, missing getting to do question of the professor directly, except on the Zoom sessions, which have been a pain in the butt, trying to get them to work. Not you guys, I wish more of y'all would call in, but it's been a pain in the butt trying to get them to work. I'm going to make it as easy for you as possible. There's no time limit on this test. Don't worry about the 4 hours or 2 hours or whatever I give you. There is no time limit. You get 3 attempts in case the computer goes down, or like I said, somebody just needed that Chinese delivery so bad that they couldn't wait a half hour for you to finish your test and locks up your computer. Got it. So we're trying to make this so that it's as user-friendly as possible. If you have any questions, please let me know. So let's go over the questions. Question 1 may or may not be the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 banned slavery north and west of the Ohio River. If you should see that sort of question, it is true. And it's asking me if I want to search. No, I don't want to search. Okay, and then next would be the successful Haitian Revolution of 1803. If somebody should ask you a true-false question on that proves nothing whatsoever, of course, and ask if it had little impact on slavery. Remember, little impact on slavery, that is false. Remember, this and a couple slave revolts they had in South Carolina around this time really put the fear of God in a lot of slaveholders, particularly in the Deep South. With the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831, this spread to anywhere that had slaves. Because if somebody who had as many privileges and freedoms as Nat Turner was going to turn and was as assimilated as Nat Turner was a slave, was going to turn against you, anybody could turn against you. So this is false. It had a huge impact on slavery. Like I said, they're getting all these refugees, telling all these horror stories. First, it's whites. Then you get another wave that's light-skinned, what they used to call high yellows or red bones, people of color who are light-skinned. Then you start seeing actual mixed-race people who look Negro or black are just suddenly starting to show up, saying, "Hey, those can't kill anybody with any trace of white blood in them." Think of this. This is slavery time, and you're talking about former slaves who are jumping on ships, jumping on rafts to try to get to slaveholding states in the American South. How bad would it have to be for that to happen? No, it's false. Okay, if somebody should ask you the question, say question 3, versus nothing whatsoever, one of the major changes in the Southern economy subsequent to, which means after, the enactment of the United States Constitution was the rise of the cotton industry and the impact of technological change in international markets in the Southern economic development. That is true. Remember, we have a whole chapter on King Cotton, and my computer just being a pain today. So, if you run into a question, say your 4th question. Wait, did I say that out loud? Following the War of 1812, one emerging threat to the unity of the United States, and somebody mentions the emergence of sectionalism, which consisted of policy and political conflicts over the differing interests of northern, southern, and western states. That is true. Remember, in a lot of cases, it wasn't just the slave issue. It was that it represented uh, slave owners and people from slave states, even if they didn't own slaves, saw the slave issue as a direct assault on everything about the South. Because you got to remember, they weren't just criticizing slavery; they were criticizing slave holders. They were criticizing the merchants who supported them. The abolitionists started as a fringe group, and like most fringe groups, criticized everything. What happened is everybody kind of agreed with the Southerners, said, yeah, they're a fringe group, don't worry about it. And then one day the Southerners passed some laws, get some laws passed that probably weren't in their long-term benefit, although short-term they love to show their power off. And all of a sudden everybody turns against them and starts agreeing with these idiots. Oh my God. Now, dueling, and sometime when you look at your $10 bill, that's how we lost Alexander Hamilton to Aaron Burr, was considered an acceptable method to settle insults between individuals prior to the 1860s and was governed by an elaborate set of rules. Oh, yes, it was. Some claim that that Burr and Hamilton's seconds both set them up to make sure that one or both of them would be killed in the duel. Matter of fact, Kentucky to this day has a state constitutional amendment that says that if you've ever participated in a duel, you are banned from holding public office. That's how bad this got at one point. So that is true. So we come to question 6, or may come to question 6. We don't know, but if you happen to see, as a result of the Missouri Compromise, Missouri was admitted to the Union as a free state based on a promise that when Kansas was admitted as a state in the future, it would enter as a slave state. No, it was precisely the opposite. And one of the real screw-ups was the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which basically undermined the entire Missouri Compromise. And, then the Dred Scott decision the next year, you had people who would have urinated on a abolitionist 5 years before who now consider themselves abolitionists. So that would be false. Remember, it's the complete opposite. They promised that Kansas would be a free state as long as Missouri could come in as a slave state. Even Missouri wasn't that hot on slavery, but the money guys showed up and wanted to expand their power, and yeah. Okay, if somebody should ask you about the subject of marriage is between slaves in the antebellum, and remember, antebellum means pre-war, and in American uses, it's almost always pre-Civil War. Sometimes it's pre-war of 1812 in New England, but in the South, in most of the South and the Midwest, that's an automatic pre-Civil War. Nobody talks about the antebellum of pre-World War II, because that means. Now, these marriages were recognized legally and were often used to prevent familial breakup and upon the foreclosure and or death of an owner. No, not at all. There were slave marriages, but they had no legal basis. Remember, slaves were property like a horse at this time. So if somebody should ask you, one result of the election of Andrew Jackson was the formation of the modern Democratic Party from a wing of the Democratic Republicans, creating the first modern American political party. Very true. That's why to this day, despite the fact that Jackson in the modern era has kind of a mixed reputation, probably not fairly because he was a man of his times, we saw Jackson Day dinners in the Democratic Party. So if somebody's asked you whether, another question would come along and ask whether one of the divisive policies of Andrew Jackson was his support of the Second Bank of the United States or his hatred of the Second. Bank of the United States in his desire to kill it. Remember, he was trying to kill the thing. So if you see a true-false question, ask him if he was supporting it. The answer is always going to be false. And then we'll talk about the American Indians a little bit. Maybe this might be question 10. I don't know. At any rate, the Cherokee Nation generally agreed to leave their traditional lands for lands in the West. Oh, hell no. They fought it in court. They fought it in among Christian denominations. They fought it anywhere they could. This is the one where Marshall passed his famous, agreed with the American Indians, mostly the Creeks and Choctaws and the Cherokees, saying these treaties are solid. And that's when Andrew Jackson said, well, the Supreme Court or Marshall has made his decision with the Supreme Court. Let's see the Supreme Court enforce it. So that would be false. They did not want to leave. So that would mean if there's another question that asks if the Christian mission movement was successful in stopping Andrew Jackson, or maybe they use the word thwarting the 1830 Indian removal policy, no, they failed badly. Andrew Jackson is going to have his trail of tears come hell or high water. And then so that brings up another point, religion in America. You might see another question, like maybe question 12 or the next question, talking about the wave of religious revivals that occurred across the United States in the first half of the 19th century had little lasting impact on Christian worship in this country. No, it had a huge impact on this. So that would be false. It had a huge impact. And then we need to talk about the role of women in here. So if you here see a question that says women were excluded from participation in religious revivals during the Second Great Awakening, no, they were central to it. So that would be false. You had women preachers for the first time. You had women church officials. Women were the driving force behind the Second Great Awakening and the first and the third. And yeah, you get the point. So ladies, when people tell you you had no power during this time, yeah, right. We'll get to that later with the petticoat affair. So we've talked about religion. So how are people getting west? So we might see a true-false question that says something along the lines of new roads, canals, and the introduction of the steamboat provided conduits for settlement in the West. Should that question be on the exam? Again, I'm barefoot, so I'm not going to stomp my feet, but and you should ask if that was true or false. That was definitely true. So now we get to talking a little bit about the Cotton Revolution. Remember, the big movement of cotton was when they got long stem cotton that could be grown, and they came up with the cotton gin that could remove the seeds from long stem cotton so they didn't have to grow it near the coast anymore. So if you see something about cotton remaining a coastal phenomenon and limited to within 50 miles of the Atlantic or Gulf of Mexico, yeah, that's a false statement altogether. And then remember, one of the most destructive financial downturns of the antebellum pre-Civil War era, we really had two of them. The big one, of course, was the Panic of 1837, and it's you could arguably say the Panic of 1857 was almost equally destructive, but was because we were a more industrialized country and we were more spread out, it wasn't as noticeable, and had better transportation so we could recover quicker. Nowhere in there will you hear the year 1844. Just take that under advisement going forward. So if you see 1844 and financial panic, they probably don't belong in the same sentence. So that brings us to question 17. Manifest destiny, the concept of Western expansion, did not exist prior to 1845. Well, we talked about the settlement of Ohio, or the Northwest Territories. We talked about the Southwest Territories, and those were all way before 1845. So that'll be a no for me, Doug. I'm going with false on that one. So if you run into question 18, just a guess by guess, and you hear and it's something about next to the emergence of cotton, the emergence of steam power was critical to the economic process of the progress of the South prior to the Civil War. Yeah, the South ran on steamboats and some railroads, but to a lesser extent than the North, but they ran on steamboats and they ran on to a lesser, to a greater extent than the North. They ran on steamboats. To a lesser extent than the North, they ran on trains. So I would say they all run on steam. So that's probably true. So we hear about Ralph Waldo Emerson. I mean, he's a great guy, had some great stuff, probably overrated, but he was an intellectual, so all the other intellectuals weren't an intellectual, so he gets dragged out all the time. Was a leading proponent of both the Young American movement and the concept of manifest destiny? No, he was an ascetic. He's the guy who wrote a lot of, pastoral stuff. He believed, harmony with nature and stuff, and going forward, fighting Indians and building a farm on what was beautiful pastoral wildlands wasn't his thing. So if you're somewhere around question 20, hey, I'm over halfway done with the true false. Wow. And if somebody asks who this consisted of and happened to talk about anti-slavery movements in the 19th century and talks about religious groups and intellectuals in Europe and the United States, yeah, that's a true statement. And then it talks about one of the most successful Christian-based social reform movements was the temperance movement, which was a movement to ban alcoholic beverages. Oh, yes, it was. I, Remember, I said one, now it probably wasn't the most important. You can make the argument the abolition movement was more important to American history. We had passed constitutional amendments against both slavery and alcohol. The one against slavery is pretty rock solid in our constitutional pantheon, whereas the one about alcohol, not so much. But it was important enough that eventually the abolitionists managed, or they're not the abolitionists, the temperance movement managed to get a constitutional amendment banning alcohol. So I'd say that was a pretty influential group there. Considering for most at the time the the 18th Amendment was passed and the time the Volstead Act was passed, the the women didn't even have the right to vote. They dominated this, but still managed to get a constitutional amendment. Oh, that's some power there. So we get into question 22. Horace Greeley was a newspaper editor, and was he famous for saying "Go West, young man"? Oh, yes, he was. That's a lot of people. That's the only thing they know about the guy. And he was actually a fascinating character, but yeah, that's probably what he's most famous for. So if you're about too short of getting to question 25, say around question 23, and you say slavery was one of the major drivers of the emerging sectional crisis between northern and southern states, yes, it was. The mere existence of slavery, not necessarily slavery itself, was even the thing. Because the point is it's sort of like abortion today in the feminist movement, where they put all their chips on that one marker because it's the one time they can have a counter morality to what, when they're doing something that's kind of morally loose, goes against some of your stated ethics and books you claim to believe in, people tend to get very defensive. And it was very true about this in slavery. Plus, we talked a lot in class about the evolution of slavery. Yeah, you get the point. So So then we've talked about this already. The women's rights movement had no association with the abolition movement. It's kind of a chicken and egg argument, but a lot of people would argue that the women's rights movement came out of the abolition movement. But then the counter argument is women becoming more socially and politically engaged, becoming more present in cities and so forth, and being more socially prominent meant that they felt they could, meant that their views on slavery were more listened to. So it's always a chicken and egg argument, but it was the women's rights movement was always heavily associated, at least in the North, with the abolition movement. And since it was far more powerful in the North than it was in the South, yeah. Now you might be hitting question 25 right about now, and you might be saying, oh my God, I'm already a quarter of the way done. Or you might be going, oh my God, I can't believe I'm only a quarter of the way done. This thing's going to take forever. Sort of like I was when I was loading this thing onto Canvas. Woo! At any rate, so we come into this question, or may come into this question. This is all theoretical. It's not like this got loaded last night or anything. Before the Civil War, Northerners perceived the federal government to be anti-slavery. Oh no, they didn't. Every decision, it was sort of like that miracle where the government's even-handed and looking at this from a totally disinterested point of view, but every decision tends to be against the anti-slavery movement. Even minor stuff that doesn't matter, they're voting for the slaveholders because they can, and that's the slaveholders have made everything slavery the primary issue to every question. Should we go get ice cream? Well, how will that affect the slavery question? That kind of bullcrap. Like I said, it can be kind of associated with abortion and the modern feminist movement. Just yeah. So yeah, Northerners thought that their politicians were dough faces and were all pro-slavery, and you'll see this with the election of Lincoln. He was sort of like a Trumpian figure where he was just going to, or Reagan back in the 80s, where he's just going to turn over the whole apple cart and everybody cheered. Brings us to, we might be starting on the second quarter of your exam. We might be just getting past 25 to the next question at this point. Maybe. So, Abraham Lincoln, the presidential candidate, received 60% of the popular vote in the 1860 election. With 8 political parties and 4 prominent ones running, not a chance. He got around 40-ish%. So if you see a question asking if he got 60% in the 1860 election, the answer is going to be false. So we talk about a Confederate vice president named Andrew Steffens, who once stated that, did he ever state that the Confederacy's foundations are laid on the corners, and on its cornerstone rests the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery is his natural and normal condition? It might be a famous speech called the Cornerstone Speech, that even when people like me who have some sympathy for the Southern cause say that slavery was a primary and proximate cause of the entire war, yeah, we kind of have to say slavery was the cause of the American Civil War. Now you'll hear people that deny this. Yeah, it was slavery. It was the fact that for whatever valid arguments the South had on internal improvements, tariffs, land distribution that they really had a problem with, that it had a legitimate argument for. Every bit they talked about states' rights is negated by their vocal support of the various Fugitive Slave Acts, including the one that pissed off most Northerners, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The reason they wanted tariffs was so they could reduce their cost of doing cotton, which, oh, by the way, was, supporting the slave economy at the expense of northern manufacturers. Yeah, it was slavery. You you know, at that time, you can more or less say that the main cause of the American Civil War in 1860 and 61 was slavery. So, if we get to question 28, if you make it that far, I think you will. You're all pretty smart. Um, all Northerners outside the border states were pro-Union, while all Southerners were pro-Confederate. Yeah, no. We've already looked at we by now you've read through the draft riots, you've read through the Copperhead movement that was popular in Ohio, which is funny because the same state that sent the most troops to the Union cause also had was probably had the most pro-Confederate, or at least pro-Southern, feelings outside of the border states. So, well, in Ohio is kind of a weird case because, it's right next to the two of the border states. At that time, Virginia, prior to West Virginia, and Kentucky. So, yeah, a lot of them had sympathies with the slave states, or the southern states. I don't think it was so much slavery as they didn't want to be fighting folks from Kentucky and Tennessee, who they were a lot alike. They're very similar to. And then, that's just one example. The the, the Union or the Ohio contributed one general to the Confederacy, whereas Virginia gave 7 flag officers to the Union. So you can see where there was a lot of section. It wasn't just a purely sectional war. There was a lot of a lot of cross loyalty. One of the most conflicted people, two of the most conflicted people were, of course, George Thomas, who ended up being Sherman's just superb leader, subordinate general, who Sherman was Ohioan, who said, hey, he's from Virginia and everybody thinks he's a Confederate agent, but I like the guy. He's good. And when he ground up Hood's in Chickamauga, where he saved the entire, Sherman was more than justified in his belief in George Thomas. Conversely, Bushrod Johnson, who fought very ably for the Confederate cause, was from Ohio. And then, of course, another of the most conflicted people was Robert E. Lee. He had the chance to be an American Cincinnatus and follow his fellow Virginian, Winfield Scott, who remained loyal to the Union, and his mentor and his friend. And instead, he felt that he couldn't fight his fellow Virginians, so he ended up on the other side. Thank God he did, because otherwise we'd have had Reconstruction would have been an even worse mess than it was. We'd had a guerrilla war that continued in the South for probably another decade. So thank God he did go the way he did, even though it was definitely not to his benefit. So that would be a false statement. So we get into Virginia and Tennessee. Were they two of the original seceding states that formed the original Confederacy? No, they were not. They did not leave the Union until Lincoln called for volunteers to put down the other southern states and felt that having to choose, they would choose their fellow southern states. So that is a false statement. As a matter of fact, large portions of both Tennessee and Virginia remained loyal to the Union. As a matter of fact, we now call that about half of that portion, West Virginia. So we get to question 30. Or we may get to question 30, I don't know. But if the Confederate Army was successful in initially thwarting the Union Army in Virginia, the Union forces in the Western Theater were more successful during the first 2 years of war. Oh, you better believe it. Far more successful. So that would probably be a true statement. So we get to the aftermath of the war. The South was economically devastated after the Civil War, did not recover economically till after the Great Depression of the 1930s. As I've said before, there's parts of the South that still haven't achieved their pre-war prominence. So I would have to say that's true. So who are we? Who are us Floridians? If somebody should ask you if during Reconstruction, Florida was in Military District 3 and was readmitted to the Union in 1868, and the state government taken over by conservative Democrats called the Bourbons in 1877 after serving as a key vote for Rutherford B. Hayes in the contested 1876 election, yeah, I would call that a true statement. The Ku Klux Klan was the only anti-black, anti-Republican militia operating in the former Confederacy during the Reconstruction era. No, there were several, and they all had different views. The Knights of the Golden Cross and Knights of the Golden Crescent. There were just all these various groups. The reason the Klan became prominent was they allied themselves with the Democratic Party in the South and more or less became a political militia, suppressing the Republican voting blacks and shaming whites into voting for Democrats regardless of their personal feelings about it. So in other words, that's why they became the most prominent of them, which is kind of funny considering who accuses who of being Klan nowadays. But hey, we didn't say our country is very historically illiterate now, did we? And so they were not the only ones. That would be a false statement. Now you get to question 34. And you may be telling yourself, if I answer this question, I'm more than a third of the way through. And you would be right. Okay, so this is where we get into the post-war era. No black leaders held elective or appointed political office during the Reconstruction era. This would be false. There were actually a lot of black elected leaders and appointed leaders who were appointed in the South. I got a helicopter going by. You have to excuse me, there's that noise. Nice old OH-6, Bell or Hughes 500. Beautiful little aircraft. Love it. But at any rate, no black leaders held, no, not at all. There were a lot of black elected leaders in Reconstruction, some of which managed to remain in office until after the turn of the 20th century, when finally in fighting the populists, in taking down the Populist Party, the Democrats also managed to redistrict most of these guys out of existence. Let's see here. You had a lot of appointed officials, many of which held office well into the 1880s for, mostly when the Democrats recovered, well into the 1880s. It wasn't until the Democrats achieved the presidency, following the 1880 election, that you would actually see these appointed officials removed in the way of what are considered nonpartisan offices like postmasters and stuff. It really wasn't until Woodrow Wilson segregated he's one of my favorite presidents. What a piece of work. When he segregated the civil service after he got elected in 1913 or took office in 1913, would you see a large number of blacks purged from like postmasters and other appointed nonpartisan positions. So that would definitely be a false. So what's if we get to there, do we ask what were the accomplishments? What were some of the enduring accomplishments of Reconstruction? If somebody should say, The establishment of public school systems in the South, both white and black, yeah, that's the true statement. So if that was one of the big ones, was the establishment of public school systems in the South, that's true. No, that's true. Okay, so if you get to 35, you're going to notice questions change. They're no longer true false. They are now multiple choice. So if say you get to question 36, you get a question like, prior to the advancement of white settlement, westward Native Americans related to the natural environment by, my answer would be adapting to it and changing it in a variety of ways that serve their own interests. So adapting to it and changing it in a variety of ways that serve their own interests. Very much like the whites that came after them. Now, of course, they changed it in different ways because they had different goals. If I'm trying to do buffalo hunting, I'm setting big fires on the plains to keep these trees from channeling, or I'm allowing trees to grow in certain areas to channel buffalo herds. If I'm a white settler, yeah, I'm not setting my grain fields on fire. So it was different, but there's a lot of similarities in that they both did change the environment, adapt to the environment, change it in ways that serve their own interests. So if you read about Tom Jefferson and why was he constriction about the Louisiana Purchase? He thought it might be unconstitutional. He really didn't care about anything else. That was his big worry, was that it was an unconstitutional purchase. So just keep that in mind. And of course, as a result of Eli Whitney's invention of the development of the cotton gin, one of the big effects, unanticipated effects, was the institution of slavery revived and expanded. Just like Alfred Nobel thought that, and Richard Gatling both thought their inventions would make war too terrible and that would prevent war from going, Eli Whitney kind of had a thought that if we make cotton this easy to process, it would be cheaper for the South to use just to a wage labor system. And that was probably true. But remember, there's a lot of things about slavery that have to do with the South's power and position in the government that would not allow that to happen. And it got worse through the 1820s, 1830s. In the 1820s and 30s, even slaveholders say, yeah, it's kind of a corrupt system. We don't like it, but we're kind of stuck with it. By the 1840s, God told us to make people slaves. Like I said, I don't think the Bible changed in that time. So why would masters, I mean, they're paying all this extra money. We talked about the social cost of slavery. The objective costs are lower, but the subjective costs are a lot higher. We talked about this in an earlier lecture. So why would they prefer these guys? Because they're harder. You have to have overseers. They have to be disciplined, which means a lot of times whipped or denied food or whatever. Why would they prefer that? Because they serve for life unless emancipated, could be disciplined freely and afforded a greater profit. Like I said, objectively, they were more profitable. Subjectively, yeah, not so much. They only worked in a closed system, but that was the slave owner's thought, was that they were making more profit off the slaves. New York bankers, of course, were laughing all the way to the bank, charging these toads almost 10% interest. But hey, they're dumb enough to pay it. We're dumb enough to charge it. So we get to, right now you might be saying, I might be 3/5 of the way done. I might be starting on question 40. That'd be kind of cool, wouldn't it? So one of the things, if a question asks what other value of slaves, was their collateral value for bank loans and other form of monetary capital. Remember, most of these plantations looked impressive. They had the servants. They had all these people looked like something out of Versailles, or at least attempted to. They weren't nearly that nice. Despite what you see in the movies, they weren't nearly that nice. But the dirty little secret, especially in the cotton regions and even the tobacco growing areas, is most of these guys were hawk up to their eyeballs. Who was going to loan them money? Bankers. What did bankers want? Collateral. That meant land. That meant water rights or whatever, and that meant primarily slaves. So amendments to the Missouri Statehood Bill in 1819 caused controversy because I would say it would be because they were gradually emancipating all the slaves in Missouri. So that's what I think would be the major problem. The idea was that Missouri would eventually become a free state, and that's what's probably started this whole mess. So if you're going to talk about the Missouri crisis, which led to, remember, which led to the Missouri Compromise, would be the opposition of southern states and slaveholding interests to Missouri's proposed constitution, which banned the importation of new slaves and forced the manumission of all existing slaves 25 years from the date of statehood. I'd say that would be a real problem, and the slave people have to show off their muscle. You know, most of Missouri is not really amiable to slave labor, but hey, we need to make a point here. So, you know, so we get to another question, and that in the 1824 presidential election, what did presidential candidate um, Harry Clay mean by his American system that he was promoting? And I would probably say that would be an establishment of protective tariffs and federal expenditures on internal improvements. That's what I'd go with. And when you get to question 44 and it asks one of the reasons Southerners feared the tariff of 1828, there were a lot of reasons they didn't like the tariff of 1828. But one of the reasons would be that of all the answers you're given, the only one that really makes sense is the imposition of federal government authority that could potentially be used to suppress slavery. There were a lot of reasons they opposed it, but that was one of them. The other ones weren't really reasons they cared, weren't anything Southerners cared about. Remember, sectionalism is a thing during this time. And how do you describe John Calhoun's relationship as vice president with Andrew Jackson? I think one of the best best insights into this is President Jackson's threat to hang Calhoun and other conspirators during the South Carolina nullification crisis. Nothing says I hate you and want you to die like threatening to have somebody hanged. So while we're talking about Andy Jackson, let's talk about the Trail of Tears. And for the Cherokee and Chickasaws, there's several th- there's several things about the Trail of Tears that are accurate, and they're all some of those are listed here, but the one that really stands out as not being accurate about the Trail of Tears is that the overwhelming majority of Native Americans forced west under the Indian Removal Act and other treaties and legislation were all moved along the Trail of Tears. No, the vast majority were not were kicked out before the Trail of Tears even occurred. The Cherokees and Chickasaws and Creeks were holdouts, and so they got they got the hard treatment. And but the majority of Native Americans didn't, or American Indians, whichever you prefer, did not go along the Trail of Tears. So funny if it would kind of be funny that 1847 was during the Mexican-American War, and if we had a question 47 that happened to be about the Mexican-American War, but let's see here. A major event in Mexico that would eventually lead to war and the expansion of slavery west was, and I would look at the war for Texas independence. That was pretty huge. And remember, there's two parts of this. You have the war for Texas independence, then that leads 5 years later to the Mexican-American War, or 7 years later to the Mexican-American War, when we annexed Texas. So just keep that in mind when you're looking through this. So before the Civil War, about 1/5 to 1/3 of all slave marriages. How were they broken up? And I would say that sale or forced migration was the main one. And I wrote the exam, so I would go with that. Now, in the mid-19th century, the abolition movement, though Christian-based, remember, these people are considered nuts, radicals, and a lot of them have other really off-the-wall ideas. We can't ban slavery. It's been around 5,000 years. Are you nuts? But but if somebody says that they were widely reviled in both the North and South, where abolition meetings were broken up by mobs, buildings burned, and abolitionists sometimes injured or killed, yeah, I would probably go with that one. So we may or may not be at question 50, which may or may not be the halfway point of this. So let's take a quick break in place. I don't have any good intermission music. And what we're looking at here is the mid-19th century influx of Irish immigrants to the United States was accompanied by, I would say, being they were primarily Catholic, I would say the growth of anti-Catholic discrimination and sentiment. That would be my guess. And that might be that we're crossing the halfway point now. This may or may not be question 51. So according to our text, the rise of the Cotton Kingdom, what do you want to say about it? I'd say it was a dynamic and unstable era in which fierce competition for land and slaves and investment capital, where fortunes could be made or lost in a matter of months. Yeah, I would say that would be the one I'd go with if that's a question. And remember, we talked about the Mexican-American War. What was the approximate cause? I would say it was probably the U.S. annexation of Texas and the movement of the U.S. Army into disputed territory. Yeah, I'd say that's probably it. So what was a movement that was associated with the Democratic Party and embraced the concept of manifest destiny? I would say that was the Young America movement. So there were several movements that grew up out of the temperance movement and the abolition movement. Ones in the mid-19th century. One of the most memorable and notable was, of course, the women's rights movement. And then you get to 55, or may not get to question 55. And one of the lasting impacts of the female education movement was, well, of course, the concept of intellectual equality between men and women. Remember, Christianity's unusual in that women were of equal worth to men, though different. Now, with this movement, we're saying they're also equal intellectually. Important step in the eventual women have the right to the same job, same benefits, same work, the vote, all this was based on that fact they're intellectually equal. Now, when you're talking about the women's rights movements in 1848, what they weren't was third wave feminists. So the last thing, remember, they understood that marriage is basically mostly to women's benefit, but, I don't know. Well, that's a tough issue, but they would never be the ones to call them for the boycott of traditional marriage as oppressive to women. Yeah, they would consider that obscene because, like I said, that's how women were protected in that era, was through marriage. Now, remember, we had that fun compromise of 1850, led to the Fugitive Slave Act, but what are the things that undermined the compromise of um, 1850 was, of course, this little thing called the gold rush, where you get all these people move to California. It becomes a state a lot earlier than people could think. Of course, they're all miners and small farm holders and folks that used to be Mexican. Now they're American Hispanics. Yeah, they're not going to work for slavery. So, yeah, that kind of upended the apple cart because the slave owners couldn't really get established in California before it voted for slavery, and it voted to become a free state. Now, what did they want more than anything else in this era? They wanted the construction of a transcontinental railroad. So, what was the most consequential result of the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision? Oh, that's a tough one. There were just so many things that it did, but the big one was it ruled that Black Americans could not be citizens. Hence, it undermined the entire basis for the Three-Fifths Compromise. Because the idea with the Three-Fifths Compromise was someday, if you free these people, they become citizens. Therefore, they count as a full vote. All of a sudden, the Three-Fifths Compromise looks like it might get overturned at some point because we've just declared that slaves cannot be citizens, cannot be anything other than their property, as far as the courts are concerned. Yeah, Roger Taney, despite his earlier reputation as being pro-Negro, pro-Black, yeah, he kind of really fornicated the canine on that one. But of course, that's what the dough faces wanted. That's what the dough faces got, and they get, like I said, everything you do has second and third order effects. So the destruction of 40% of the United States and the wiping out of about 5% of the population, yeah. I don't think he was thinking that one through when he made that decision. Now we get back to our good buddy Andrew Stevens. What was his cornerstone speech? Of course, we've already heard this one. The great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, and slavery is his natural normal condition. Like I said, you can't make the argument that Confederate independence or Confederate separation or secession was anything other than primarily driven by slavery. Now, was slavery being used for symbolism of a lot of the Southern points? Yeah, but they had moved all their chips to black on that one, or red, whichever you want to go on the roulette wheel, and it didn't work out real well for them. Okay, Winfield Scott, he's old, he needs help getting on his horse, he's kind of fat. You saw the pictures of him if you looked at my lecture on the Civil War. But he did come up with one thing. He was still a brilliant mind. His body was broken, but his mind had. So before he left office, he came up with how they were going to beat the South, but through land and naval operations, and it was called the Anaconda Plan. Masterful strategic thinker. So we already are with the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't apply to anywhere under federal or Union control. So basically, it only freed South slaves only in those areas where the federal government had no control. Now remember, it's baby steps. That's all Lincoln could get away with in 1862 or at least 1863, so he got away with what he could. Later, this would expand slightly. Following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, what can you say about Andrew Johnson, I said a lot about him both in Presidential Challenge and in the lecture about Reconstruction. One of the things you can really say behind him was he was in opposition to the 1866 Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment, and was not a big fan of Negro rights. Remember, he was about punishing his enemies from the pre-war Democratic Party and getting his friends in power who were Democrats. Making the South a permanent Republican, fiefdom. Yeah, that wasn't about. He was not about that at all. He was. So that gets into why was he opposed to this? The first federal attempt to define all native-born Americans, except American Indians, as citizens to pass Congress was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Because remember, the 13th Amendment, it went through the Senate, but remember, it's not passed by Congress. It is passed by the states. So remember that. People don't think American government be like that, but it do. The states are you have to have three-quarters of the states for any constitutional amendment, which is why everybody tries to do stupid stuff using policies and open-ended legislation, because if you actually govern by the Constitution, it's a real pain to change it. It's a real pain. So we do side things. We have certain amendments we really love and certain amendments we really hate, and some we don't. We love it and hate it. Like, for instance, free speech. We really love that one, but boy, when it comes to that same one talks about freedom of religion, yeah, we're not about that. We try to restrict those guys, like we can see in the current Black Swan event. A lot of people have really let their inner fascist come out on this one. According to our text, the practical destruction of the slave system was accomplished through a constitutional amendment. You can equally say the destruction of the South, but hey, they had to sign the 13th Amendment to come back in, so yeah, they're kind of tied together. Now, you might run into something, say, almost a third of the way through, like you're hitting question 66, and it might ask you, beginning in 1865, why did the Southern states adopt a series of laws under the Black Codes? If you're talking about keeping blacks subordinate to whites, you are on it. So that brings us to maybe question 67, and we may have an issue about the section of the 14th Amendment that had the greatest legal significance in subsequent years was the one that conferred citizenship on freedmen and prohibited the states from abridging their constitutional rights. Clearly, that's the one that had the most long-term impact. A lot of those other ones were actually relatively temporary in nature. Now you might want to be keeping count, because if you just did questions 66 and 67, you are now 2/3 of the way through. If you got every question right up to this point, and you answer three more questions correctly, congratulations, you just passed the exam. Ooh, that's pretty cool. So somebody should ask you, according to our text, Reconstruction ended when the Democrats assumed control of Southern state governments in 1873 and 1877, and this was called being redeemed or redemption. Yeah, that's how strong they were about ending Reconstruction. A driving fact: why did the North let this happen? Well, because we had this little thing called the Panic of 1873. Yeah, another depression. So people, you know how it is. Back people had a two-party system. They didn't just flexibly vote Democrat or Republican. Some did, but we really didn't have professional sports, so people didn't treat their politics like a sports team. The Democrats say, we are going to lift this burden from you. Look at this all this problem the Republicans have caused. We're in war. We're in Reconstruction. We got troops everywhere. We got all this, and then you got a faction within the Republican Party called the Liberal Republicans who were tired of the war. We're tired of Reconstruction. We're civil libertarians. Really had a problem with how Reconstruction was being enforced, especially when Grant took over. Because we talked about him, he said if you're going to do hard war, well, he's going to do hard Reconstruction. Now the problem was Reconstruction had pretty much, because of Andrew Johnson's policies, had pretty much been discredited in much of the South. He was going to make it work, and he did, but yeah. So basically, civil rights were taken overrun by economic concerns. So what was the key organization that kept the African Americans who assisted them in overcoming the legacies of slavery, and is to this day serves as a nexus for education, organization, civil rights, is of course Black Christian churches. So we get to question 70. The impasse of the 1876 presidential election was broken by the Compromise of 1877. Remember the issue you run into. Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a very anti-slavery, very pre-war abolitionist, had made general officer fighting in the Civil War, but he was forced to swallow this compromise where he would withdraw all federal troops from the South in order to become president, because he lost the popular vote, because like I said, we're coming off this really bad depression. People are hurt and they want change, and but he won the electoral vote. But 3 of those states that he won were in the South, and by the way, they were redeemed in the 1876 election. So their legislatures in 1877 tried to withdraw and send a competing group of electors to the Electoral College saying, no, we didn't really mean it. We actually meant that we were going to vote for Tilden. So how did they overcome this? They agreed to withdraw the troops from the South, and that was really the stake through the heart of Reconstruction. Some of it would stumble on until about 1881, at which time the Democrats re-achieved power, and at the national level. And by the way, at this time, the House and Senate were both Democrats, so the idea that you were going to get any civil rights bills, which were seen as pro-Republican, weren't going to happen. We would not see another major civil rights bill pass Congress until Dwight David Eisenhower's presidency in 1957. So you'll notice the questions may change. So what you have here is a box. Now I'm not going to tell you the answers, but I will tell you that you have to type them in. If it's a proper noun where it refers to a specific event or a specific era, I've given you as many options as you can. Remember, capitalization if it's something specific, common if it just means a noun that isn't specific to a certain time. So let's see if I capitalize the, and then I capitalize G. Great. And then I spell awakening, and remember to spell it correctly. The Great Awakening, and I hit. That should work. It'll also work with the Second Great Awakening as well, because that's technically what it was. Of course, that's saying, so we get to another one so I get to this one, and it asks, the Protestant Christian movement that spread through camp meetings, circuit rides, and emphasized a more personalized religious faith, a more direct relationship with God, individual salvation through faith, intended to encourage the establishment of the emergent Christian denominations over established would be known as the Great Awakening or the Second Great Awakening. If you're going to do it, it's the, capital T-H-E, second, at capital S-E-C-O-N-D, and then space, of course, space between these. Great, capital G-R-E-A-T, and then capital A-W-A-K-E-N-I-N-G. Remember to spell these correctly, put them in the right order. I don't like this system, but my word bank got disintegrated after about the sixth question when I tried to do this, and I had to redo this entire section. I was up till 3 in the morning thanks to y'all. I'm blaming you. Not really. My own stupidity. So a collective movement that of reform societies that proliferated through the United States between 1850 and 1861, growing directly out of the 19th century Christian revivalism, which melded religion and reform into a powerful force in American culture, was known as, if I had to answer this and type it in, I would say the Benevolent Empire. You can put quotation around and around, capital T-H-E, and then benevolent, and then empire, capital E-M-P-I-R-E. Now, I try to get as many misspellings into the word bank as possible. Like I said, the problem is if I try to get it to display the word bank, it priced the entire system, so all I can do is put the words into the answer. Try to give you as many different ones, but if you do it that way, it should work. Now, like I said, I have some other variations. I have like 9 for that one, so do your best. Now, for the next one where you're typing in, just so you know what this looks like. I don't know if you've done this in other classes or not, but that's kind of what it's going to look like for you. One of Congress's first attempts to solve the slavery issue was and it's a state, something compromise of 1820. Well, we know that's a state. We know how to spell Missouri. Again, proper noun, so it's capitalized. Make sure you know how to spell Missouri. And then the extensive rise of the King Cotton agricultural economy was enabled by the invention of, and then we spell out C-O-T-T-O-N space G-I-N. Cotton gin. So now you hit question 75 and you say, you know, when I'm done with this, I'm 3/4 of the way done. If I have answered every question correctly to this point, I have passed this test. Isn't that a cool feeling? So despite not having the franchise, one incident that showed the increasing political influence and impact of women in the mid-19th century, even at the highest level of the federal government, was you can say, I put in several for this one. You can say the Eaton affair, the Petticoat affair, anything like that. I don't think I did Petticoat. I think I did Petticoat Rebellion too, but I would say the Eaton affair or the Petticoat affair are your best choices. Remember, Eaton is a guy's name, so it's E-A-T-O-N, and then affair, capital A-F-F-A-I-R, because it's a specific affair. You could also put that in parentheses; it'll still work. Or the Petticoat affair, either with parentheses or without parentheses. So the second modern political party that in the United States, which was formed by disparate opponents of Andrew Jackson, fringe parties, and the other opponents of the newly formed Democratic Party, were known as then Whig Party, W-H-I-G, and again capitalized W, and then P-A-R-T-Y, capitalized P, because it actually is a party. I think I put some other variations in there. So hopefully that'll go through. I'll probably have to review. If you don't score well on this, I will review it to see what you did put. But please work on the spellings and stuff. I'm not saying you can have your book there to, the glossary on your book would have all these spelled correctly. If you have the American Yelp open to the glossary to get the spellings right, yeah, it won't hurt my feelings. Because if they want to be pricks about spelling, I'm going to give you the necessary tools to accomplish that. So we talk about the 8-year presidency of President Jackson. Now, this happened after he left office, but remember, we talked about the Panic of 1837. So that's what wiped out most of the prosperity of his time. So capital P-A-N-I-C, lowercase of, and then 1837, Panic of 1837. So what was one of the most notable slave revolts was, and remember, guy's name, it's going to be Nat Turner, N-A-T, space, capital N-A-T, space, T, capital T, U-N-E-R. So just the uppercase N, uppercase T, and then Nat Turner. He is going to be your man for this. Okay, when it comes to balance, what killed it? Remember, we talked about what year did Florida become a state? 1845. What year did Texas become a state? 1845. What did this do to the balancing of the slave and the free acts? Well, that screwed it up. So the annexation of, remember, Florida was already a territory, so it was annexed. So and it mentions Florida as the admission of Florida. So T-E-X-A-S. Capital T-E-X-A-S should answer that question if you should run into that and be hanging around somewhere just short of 4/5 of the way done, because your next question would be 80. And according to our text, by the middle of the 19th century, the most important cash crop supporting Southern agricultural economy was, and don't say corn because they were making moonshine. That's where I'm from, but for the most part, it was tobacco. T-O-B-A-C-C-O, tobacco. Mr. Polk's War is the name opponents gave of President James Polk's policies, used to label the 1848, and then you can go Mexican, capital M-E-X-I-C-A-N, and then a dash, and then American, capital A-M-E-R-I-C-A-N. So Mexican American. Just like we have Mexican American people, we had a Mexican American War, which is kind of weird because Mexico is technically in North America. Okay, we'll leave that one alone. Okay, one factor that unexpectedly undermined Congress's compromise of 1850 and resulted in the Fugitive Slave Act. We talked about this. Was the discovery of gold, G-O-L-D, in California. So we're talking about states' rights. Remember, we talked about the South said they're all for states' rights that they like, but the one they didn't like was the North's ability not to enforce stupid federal laws about slave states and slave acts and the fugitive. So we passed, South gets this whole thing called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which is like the epitome of no states' rights. So if you see that blank informed the Northerners due to its violation of states' rights, talked about the use of federal law, federal posses and everything else. Yeah, you can say the Fugitive Slave Act, and I think I programmed in it'll take Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, because there were other Fugitive Slave Acts, but this was the one that was the biggest stomp on slave rights, which is the one people tend to remember. Northern politicians who were seen as too friendly to Southern interests, especially the slave oligarchs, were known as dough-faces. Doughfaces, and I would capitalize it. Now you can even put that one in parentheses. So if you get to 85 and you say, I'm 85% of the way done. If I got everything right so far, I got an easy B, you would be correct. So Supreme Court decision that was supported by both President Buchanan and Chief Justice Taney to permanently settle the sectional slavery issue, but instead inflamed controversy and confirmed to many on both sides of the slavery controversy the federal government was intent on spreading slavery nationwide was the Dred Scott. To spell his name, D-R-E-D space. That's a capital D. He is a person. He is a man. Scott, S-C-O-T-T. So Dred Scott looks kind of like that. It's going to try to tell you it's misspelled. No, it's not. So question 86. While most immigrants to California arrived by sea prior to the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, large numbers of immigrants to the Pacific Northwest traveled by Conestoga wagons along the Oregon Trail. It was actually a cool video game back in the old days. So O-R-E-G-O-N, capital O, Oregon, just like the state. Because back then, Oregon and Washington and parts of Idaho, Montana, and so forth were all considered, Montana and so forth were all considered part of the Oregon Territory. According to our text, the growth of King Cotton economy came at the expense of traditional southern cash crops, primarily tobacco, T-O-B-A-C-C-O. Blank was a process by which Americans privately financed military expeditions to seize unclaimed, disputed, and foreign lands on behalf of the United States. Remember, these are private individuals filibustering, and you can go with or without parentheses, capital F-I-L-I-B-U-S-T-E-R-I-N-G. It will also take filibuster. Now we get to question 89. Due to the struggle between the slave and the free state advocates, which included ambushes, murder, lynching incidents, and the sack of the town Lawrence, this state was known as Bleeding. Where's Lawrence? Well, it's in Kansas. So K-A-N-S-A-S. Now we get to question 90, and you might be asking yourself, if I answer this correctly, and I've answered all my other questions correctly, I will have achieved an A. Yes, you will have. So an anti-slavery activist named Blank, already famous for his brutality against pro-slavery elements in Kansas, led an ultimately unsuccessful raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia in 1859 with hopes of triggering a slave revolt for which he was tried and sentenced to death. This is where Jeb Stuart and Robert E. Lee, as Union officers, led Marines and local militia to capture this guy. And his name, of course, was John Brown, capital J-O-H-N space, capital B-R-O-W-N. Now, the reason I don't think you're dumb, but remember this thing, I told you I didn't like to use this because it's very spelling sensitive. So I am trying to help you with the spellings because I'm the idiot who had to load all those spellings. And even though I put 12 different variations on a lot of these spellings, this computer will, or the computer that runs Canvas will, in a heartbeat, tell you that you're wrong, even when you're right. So like when they ask you those password questions and you transpose and you spell your school with different, without the exact same keystrokes or from a different computer than where you put it in, and your high school spelled differently, or your elementary school, or your first pet's name, and you spell it, and you know it's the right one because you know what your first pet's name was. Mine was Squirt the dog, and or Squirt, and it tells you you're wrong. No, dude, I know who my first. Well, this crap thing does the same thing. So the trigger for the initial secession of South Carolina from the United States in 1860, followed by 6 other Deep South states in early 1861. Bastards didn't even let him get inaugurated. Was the election of what was our president? He's on the penny. He's on the $5 bill. Abraham Lincoln. So to review the spelling, capital A and then Braham, Abraham, then space, capital Lincoln. For some reason, people like to put that L in there. So we get to question 92. The first shots of the American Civil War were fired in Charleston Harbor when the South Carolina militia bombarded U.S.-held Fort Blank on 12 to 13 April 1861. You don't have to put Fort in. I've made it so you could, but you don't have to. It's Sumter, Sumter. I think I got all the varied spellings, but capital Sumter is what you want to put in that blank. Now, so question 93 goes, though it was also under effective siege, Fort Pickens near the Confederate-held city of blank, Florida, remained in U.S. possession. That would be Pensacola, capital Pensacola. Think of it as like a soda pop. Pensacola, only one word. So capital Pensacola. The bloodiest single day in American military history occurred during the Battle of, you can either use Antietam or Sharpsburg on 17 September 1862. I've made it so you can do both. So you kids who learned about your Confederate ancestors and have the family history where they've always called it Sharpsburg, I made it easy for you because so you can use Antietam or Sharpsburg. We use Antietam. No, we don't use. So when you load Antietam, if you're using Antietam, remember it's AINTIETAM. So let's go over that again. ANTIETAM. Sharpsburg will be spelled S, just like it sounds, and it's one word. SHARPSBURG. Sharpsburg. Both those will be capitalized because Antietam's the name of a creek, and also now the name of a battlefield, and Sharpsburg's named after the village it's near. So we get to 1863. Both new Union and Confederate governments faced popular discontent over economic hardship and military draft policies and most destructive draft riots. in terms of death and property damage in the north occurred in, don't say Richmond, that's the south, so it's New York City, capital N-E-W space Y-O, capital Y-O-R-K, and then capital C-I-T-Y. That brings us to question 96. We're getting along. So, while Richmond and Petersburg were under siege by armies, by 1864, the Union Army was doing hard war. While Richmond and Petersburg were under siege by armies directly commanded by Ulysses Grant, the city of blank fell to forces commanded by William T. Sherman on 2 September 1864, which assisted in the re-election of Lincoln, as well as setting the stage for Sherman's march to the sea, the fall of Savannah, and the destruction of much of South Carolina. And that would be, sometimes when you're driving through it, you wonder, where's General Sherman when you really need him? We'll have to fly through it. Atlanta, Atlanta. Capital A-T-L-A-N-T-A. The Civil War was the most destructive war ever fought in American history. Between 650,000 and 1.2 million soldiers and civilians died as a direct result of the war, and over 200,000 widows and women were left widows. Over one half of all war casualties were due to sickness or disease, either one works. So disease. D-I-S-E-A-S-E, disease. The southernmost battle of the American Civil War, and I think you should automatically fail if you get this one wrong, was fought for the control of Fort Blank in March of 1865. And that would be Myers. M-Y-E-R-S. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? We've heard of that city before. Seems kind of local to us. Don't know why. The Blank Amendment abolished all forms of slavery and forced servitude except for punishment and for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Not the 14th. That's the one that gave blacks and other folks except for American Indians citizenship. But so this will be the 13th of May. You either spell it out 13th, or you can just put 13 and TH. And then question 100. Oh, wow. If you got all of these right, you will have gotten 100. Would be the U.S. Civil War general elected in 1868 was Ulysses Grant. Or you can just put Grant, G-R-A-N-T. So we'll put Ulysses S. Grant, although you only have to put Grant. So we get into question 101. These are your bonus questions. So these cover the entire semester. So Virginia defined its customs of slavery when it declared that children would inherit the status of their mothers. That's true. For some reason, I put bonus question 1, bonus question 2, and so forth, but this thing defaulted to calling them question 101, question 102. And after being at this until 3 in the morning, getting 2 exams loaded, I have 3 more to load. I just wasn't feeling going back. So no American Civil War battles were fought in the state of Florida. Yeah, false. We just talked about that 2 questions up. And we talked about, 2 of them. We didn't talk about Battle of Ostende, which was another big one, but we'll save that one for another day. So which of the following best describes the Salem witch trial crisis of 1692? Remember, I use this as an example. This is an example of America's need to go look inward for enemies. We talk about the Gannon Hut massacre being when Americans look out externally for enemies, whether they deserve it or not. This is when we look internally, because people were occurred in an area where people were especially fearful of potential Indian attacks from the north. They're locked up in their houses. They can't get out and move around. Unlike us, where we can't get, where we have to go around singly or in small groups, they had to go around in large groups just to go to their own fields, cause a lot of paranoia. And rather than, you know, of course, our Scots, Irish, and Germans wanted, they're looking for somebody external to hammer. These are our Puritans, the WASPs, who in a lot of ways set the intellectual temper for our elite classes to this day. They are looking for somebody internally to beat up on. I guess because going out and fighting Indians if you're a teenage girl is pretty hard. I don't know. So question 104. This is the determination about the state's population. This is key to the understanding why the Dred Scott decision was so awful. And that's the 3/5 would be counted towards the population locals, to the population totals. But remember, if you free or give a man munition, they count as a full person. This was a carrot to get slave owners to give up their slaves. And then I had to change this question. It used to be name a Florida county, but there's no way I was going to put 12 Florida counties with all their various variations. We name a Florida county named after a Civil War soldier. Yeah, this one either I don't know which one I put right. Hendry is correct. Lee is use capital spelling of Hendry, or Hendry or Lee will either one will be correct. This was supposed to be this one will be a fill in the blank. You spell Lee, capital Lee. Hendry is spelled capital Hendry. This will be a fill in the blank question. So let's see how we did. So as we look through, just remember when 24, when it says the emergence women's rights movement had no association with the abolitionist movement, that would be false. And like we talked about, the Civil War, remember the Northerners perceived the federal government to be anti-slavery. That would be false. So remember the Dred Scott was ruled that black Americans could not be citizens. You remember Scott's Anaconda Plan. Remember that Andrew Johnson was opposed to the 1866 Civil Rights Act and 14th Amendment. Just some of the key ones I'm picking out as we go. Okay, when you do the Eaton Affair, make sure you put the Eaton Affair in front. Wait a second. I have to fix that. I put the in front of all these. Do not put the in front of the Eaton Affair. Just put Eaton Affair or Petticoat Affair. Okay, Whig Party, remember that one? Remember Panic of 1837? Remember Turner is spelled Natturner. Boy, I hate this. So you get to question 80, according to our text, by the middle of the 19th century, the most important cash crop supporting the southern agricultural economy was long stem cotton. So you spell out LONGSTEMCOTTON or just COTTON. Just say cotton. COTTON. Okay, 81 will be Mexican-American War. Remember gold. Remember the Fugitive Slave Act. Remember dough faces. Remember Dred Scott. Remember Oregon. Remember tobacco when it comes to what did cotton displace, and that was tobacco. Question 80 is what was the main crop? It was cotton. I spell COTTON, capital COTTON. And then the what crop did it displace? Tobacco, TOBACCO. Now we have filibustering. Kansas, remember that one? John Brown, Abraham Lincoln. Remember the spelling of Sumter, Pensacola, New York City, Atlanta. Disease, Fort Myers. 13th Amendment, Ulysses S. Grant, and so forth. Now, one of the things I did notice was it got a few of mine wrong, marked a few of mine wrong that I was actually correct in. And then one I screwed up 80, I called it tobacco, and it was actually cotton. So, yeah, I'm caught on that one. But, on some of these, it was misspellings or so on. So when you do it the first time, if you get a low score, look through this and mark down what spellings were off. And so, if you go through here, it tells you what spelling, when you go through this with the spellings, go through and see what spellings are off, and then go back and correct those. Because what you'll see is a word bank will pop open on your first go around. So if you know you filled in the blank right, go see what the spellings were, because sometimes, like I said, this thing's really touchy on the spellings. Normally I wouldn't tell you to do this to an exam, but I'm telling you to do this to an exam just because I don't like how this is set up. So as you finish up, like I said, the last one will be Lee. We'll use Lee or Hendry just because I don't want to put in all the variations of spellings for 12 different guys' names. No, I'm not feeling it. So enough said. This should complete our lesson. Remember, you'll have next week. You'll have from the 20th to the 25th to complete the exam. If you can't complete it in that window, I need to know immediately. Let me know. So until later, this is Professor Kaserman, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow on our Zoom call-in.